Good evening. My name is Nancy Leifer, and I am pleased to welcome you to this webinar on the Freedom to Vote Act. I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Montana, and it's my great pleasure to be able to offer this program to you this evening. I'd like to thank our co-sponsoring organizations, the AAUW of Montana, the AAUW of Missoula, the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center, the Great Falls Rising, Montana Now, National Organization for Women, and the local League of Women Voters chapters in Billings, Bozeman, Helena, and Missoula. Never has the passage of voting rights legislation at the national level been more important or more essential to preserving our democracy. Last April, the League of Women Voters Montana hosted a webinar on the For the People Act with special guest speakers from the Brennan Center for Justice. Now there is a new voting rights bill, the Freedom to Vote Act, that has the potential to win the support needed to become law. The League of Women Voters is hosting this webinar to help our membership, the membership of co-sponsoring organizations, and the public more fully understand the contents of the Freedom to Vote Act. I'm also happy to say that we again have a special guest speaker from the Brennan Center this evening to present information on the Freedom to Vote Act. I am honored to introduce our guest speaker, Elizabeth Hira. Elizabeth may be familiar to some of you, as she was one of our special guest speakers for the April webinar. Elizabeth Hira is a Spitzer Fellow and Policy Counsel with the Brennan Center, focusing on large-scale democracy reform that centers on equity. Elizabeth worked most recently as a lawyer in the US Congress, first for Senator Kamala Harris, developing federal policy on gender equity and civil rights, and later serving on the Committee on House Administration to develop the first version of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, for the 116th Congress. Elizabeth has worked globally and domestically on equity for women, children, and underserved communities. She holds a BA from Stanford University and earned her JD at Georgetown Law. And in terms of working globally and domestically, Elizabeth also worked in Montana. Elizabeth worked with the National Archives branch in Gardner, Montana, and still considers Gardner to be one of her favorite places on the whole entire earth. So Elizabeth will be answering questions from you, from the audience, following her presentation. So I encourage those of you who, as she is making her presentation, if a question comes to mind, please go ahead and type it in the Q&A. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Zoom Q&A, but at the bottom of your screen there, if you put your cursor over the black part of your screen, a little Q&A sign should pop up. And if you put your cursor and click on it, the Q&A box will open and you can type in your questions, hit return, and that will send it to our question screeners who will help prepare those questions for Elizabeth to answer at the end of her presentation. So please do type in your questions. That's why we're here, is to get our questions answered. So now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce and turn this particular presentation over to Elizabeth Hira.
I am so thrilled to be with you all tonight. I know that there are a million other things that you could be doing, and the fact that you have chosen to dedicate time and thought and effort to this leaves me certain that we're all doing the right thing, because I know, as Nancy and I have spoken about, you all are ambassadors to your community, and Montana matters so much for so many reasons, but this bill has tremendous potential to really have an impact right where you guys are. So I'm thrilled to get to share the content with you. You are very familiar with the landscape. I'm pretty sure that's why you're here. So again, I have the incredible privilege of getting to represent the Brennan Center, and we track what's happening at the state legislative level. As of this October, our latest report shows that in 49 states, over 425 bills have been introduced to restrict your right to vote. And we know that I think upwards of 30 of them have actually passed, and Montana is no stranger to that, unfortunately. Now, when people talk about this, I think it's perfectly reasonable for folks to feel overwhelmed or despondent about what that actually looks like. That 49 states are trying to do this. My fun fact is that Vermont is the only state that hasn't. I always say it's because Ben and Jerry's must be keeping them happy. But people get stressed out because they think, oh God, we've got to fight 49 fights. And I feel like the reason I'm so thrilled to be doing these is because I get to just chat with people like you who care so much and share this good news that we don't have to fight 49 fights. We actually have to fight one fight. And that fight is with these two federal bills that I'm here to talk to you about tonight. So primarily we're going to talk about the For the People Act, but the Freedom to Vote Act, which is the newest iteration of the For the People Act, And that, alongside with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, is going to change the game for all of these people who are trying to suppress our right to vote. So tonight, I'm going to talk to you about the content of the bill so that you can be smart about that and really be inspired by what's in it. And my second part of this conversation is really why this matters. It is the context of the bill that I think those of us that are going to get on the Zoom tonight are really going to care about the freedom to vote. And we inherently think that that matters. But I think there's a second part of the story that can compel other people. So I'm thrilled to be able to do both of those with you tonight. So with that sort of table setting, I am going to jump right into what is in this Freedom to Vote Act. So like I said, the original bill was called the For the People Act. It was presented and passed in the as HR 1 in the 116th Congress, and it showed back up in the newest Congress, the 117th, as the Freedom to Vote Act. A lot of it is actually quite similar to the bread and butter of the For the People Act, and I'm surprised and thrilled about how powerful it actually is. So what I'm going to do with you is share, I think, the top highlights so that you don't have to read the 594 pages of the bill, though of course I strongly recommend that you do in case you want to induce a coma. But if you don't want to, that's what I'm here for. So I'm going to just kick us off with some of the big ticket items. So the first thing that the Freedom to Vote Act would do is establish automatic voter registration, which is actually already present in 19 states across the country. And again, that's states that are red and blue. It's proven to work. It's really effective. And that actually just works with the simple process of you going into the DMV. And when you're in there, as part of your interaction, the DMV person says, hey, Holland, would you like to sign up and become a registered voter? Holland can say, nope, I'm not interested in that at all. And she can opt out. Or she can say, actually, and I hope that she does say, yes, I'd love to be registered. And then you're registered and you never have to think about it again. Just right there at the DMV at a place that has the credibility to ask you the right questions about your eligibility and really just kind of get it squared away all at once. Another feature of the bill, and fun fact, that feature alone would add millions of Americans to the voter rolls, tens of millions of Americans. Another one that I think is incredible is the same-day voter registration part of this bill, which I know matters a ton to you guys in Montana because of what's just happened. We all know that same-day voter registration is a simple and, again, effective tool to bring in so many more voters. So it's currently in effect in 20 states already. Again, like I said, red and blue states. And something I always like to lift up is that same-day voter registration matters, particularly for voters who are currently underrepresented. And that is young people and people of color particularly. So we know that Black voters and Hispanic voters respectively reported, 11% of them reported, the single reason they did not vote is because they were not registered. And that's compared to 3% of white voters. Similarly, same-day voter registration could literally increase the youth vote by 10%, which again is millions of young Americans who are currently being left out of the system. And as I know is happening in Montana right now, there are threats to young people being able to participate, particularly college-age voters. And same-day voter registration would actually help with that a lot. Another thing that it does is provide for 2 weeks of early voting, including weekends and before and after work. Now, you often hear about these measures as sort of racial justice measures, which is great. But one of the things I really like to highlight is that this bill is really important along with a lot of our identities, and gender is an example that I like to raise here. So early voting, you might think, well, that's like neutral. That's not, necessarily helping one group more than another. But one thing I think is amazing is when you have voting limited to one day of just, bank hours, basically during one day on election day, the people who are least able to participate are those who have the least flexibility in their jobs, where they can't pop out of their office like I can for a couple of hours and go vote and come back, or they're not paid, right, if they do that. They may not have flexibility because they're wage and hour workers. And the example that I give here is that a startling statistic that I think is important is that of the lowest paid workers in America, those who lack the flexibility I'm talking about to pop out and go vote. So those people who hold those jobs that are the lowest paid, which is being paid under $10 an hour in America, 2/3 of those people are women. It's women who are having the jobs that have the least flexibility to be able to pop out. And we all know it. I think if you're a woman on this call, you've probably experienced, you've got to get the kids out and ready for school, pack lunches, get out the door, get everybody off and ready for the day, and then hope to God that you can get out of work at the end of the day in time to be able to actually make the polls before they close if you want to access your vote. And that just doesn't make any sense. So early voting creates flexibility for those workers who are relying on hourly schedules. And like I said, again, it's predominantly women. It also does really common sense things like make election day a national holiday, which is a really popular measure all across the country. It provides, and they also they think of the mechanisms that are in this really nuanced way that I really appreciate. So one part of the bill provides for voter registration information actually being given out at naturalization ceremonies. So when you become a new American, right in that process, that same day, they're saying, hey, one of the great sacred obligations we have as citizens is to vote. And so, you're welcome to this process. It also allows for the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, which is really important because, again, as I know you guys are facing in Montana, they are targeting young voters to not be able to participate. So this bill would make it so that a 16 or 17-year-old who goes to the DMV, usually to get their driver's license, gets asked, hey, do you want to be registered? And that pre-registration automatically kicks in when they turn 18, so they don't have to worry about it. And those of you particularly who have college kids and stuff at home, they don't know where their mail is. They haven't figured out, what's going to their dorm. And this solves all of that stuff, just gets your kids ready to vote and to, again, really take part in that sacred process. It expands and authorizes grant programs to ensure access for people with disabilities, so voters with disabilities can vote in the same way that voters without disabilities do. And really importantly, it funds states so that they can be in compliance with these mandates. It's not just demanding things and not saying states can get the support they need to carry them out, but actually it's giving states the resources they need to make that possible. This is a new development and distinct from the For the People Act, but so there's a new development around voter identification. The bill does not require voter ID in states that don't already have it. But if a state does already have a voter ID requirement, it does really powerful work to create national uniform standards about what that voter ID requirement looks like. So it expands the list of permissible ID that can be used. And that includes everything from your passport or your existing driver's license. But if you don't happen to have that, your utility bill can be used, or your hunting license, your gun license, your Medicare card, your Medicaid card. The list is really thoughtful about collecting a diverse type group of Americans. And if you don't even have those things, you can still go ahead and participate if you can find someone who has known you for 6 months and can come to the polls with you. And we know, again, particularly on places like the reservation where communities really know each other. And I know in rural Montana, like Nancy said, Gardner, everybody knows each other. So you could find somebody to come with you and to say, hey, I don't have, a credit card or a bank statement like these guys want, but if you could just come stand with me and we both sign sworn testimony that it's me, then I can go ahead and vote on a regular ballot. And so that, again, is a really important part of how we do ID. Another thing that I think is really important about the ID requirement is that this bill requires that if you're a registered voter and that voter ID requirement exists in your state, guess what? The state is responsible, with support from the federal government for the financial part of this, to actually provide you an ID, which I have just never seen before. I think that's such a neat feature that you get an ID free of charge if you become a registered voter. And if your state's going to go ahead and have an ID requirement, then your state better support you to get the ID that you need to participate to vote. It also protects voting by mail. A lot of states have been trying to restrict voting by mail. So we saw like Texas, for instance, was trying to say you can only vote by mail if you're over 65, which again is sort of a demographic attack on young people who are, again, increasingly diverse. The young people right now, it's kind of crazy. They are the most educated generation we've ever seen, and they're also 48% non-white. So I always sort of throw that out because I want folks to understand what some of these efforts are really targeting. I think they're targeting these young kids who are really politically engaged because they're seeing climate change happen in real time. They're seeing these things, they're seeing student loan debt balloon. They're feeling these things in ways that are really unique, and they are coming out into the populace in these ways that really matter. I also want to share, in case there are any young folks on the call, one thing that explains, I think, why there's such a targeting of young people, as you guys have seen in Montana, is that as of April of 2020, millennials and Zoomers together became the largest potential voting bloc in the electorate, where they now represent a greater portion of the population than boomers do. And so I think telling young people that, telling them that if they come out, they can change the outcomes of these elections really matters, particularly when you're seeing a lot of folks run who don't necessarily feel like they represent young people, which we'll get to later in this campaign finance reform piece. So like I said, that's voting by mail. Also, something that's really critical we saw in the pandemic, this bill provides for secured drop boxes. And those are available for your vote 24 hours a day, and they are secured, and they've worked, and they've been incredibly important for communities, again, that don't have that flexibility or are living in places where they can't sort of make it to the polls and be in line for that day. The bill prohibits states from restricting curbside voting, which again, we saw was really important in the pandemic. You should be able to pull up in your car the same way that you do to your bank and vote safely and securely, which we've proven we can do. This bill protects that. A really special part of the bill for me is democracy restoration. So currently, I think in 29 states across the United States, if you were a formerly incarcerated person, there are restrictions on your ability to vote, even though you were back in your community and you've served your time. This bill would make it so that if you were in your community, you are voting. And again, because of sort of the racial implications in mass incarceration, wholly, this provision alone would bring 3.9 million Americans back onto the rolls. And of that 3.9, 1.6 million of those people are people of color. And again, speaking of Montana, I just think it's really critical to point out that we see over incarceration of people of color, especially Native Americans. And so we know that in states that have high concentrations of Native Americans, what we're seeing is, North Dakota is the example that I have, they're actually incarcerated at 7 times the rate of their white counterparts. And so with that sort of targeting that goes on, you see how taking away the franchise, when the franchise is already limited for these other sorts of reasons, really affects these communities in some pretty profound ways. Additionally, the bill protects folks from voter purging. So, there are challenges that people will sometimes make, and they may not be on grounds that are reasonable. And so this bill sort of lays out clearly that grounds do need to be reasonable to be able to be removed from the rolls. The bill prohibits interference in voter registration, and it prevents election subversion by putting restrictions on the removal of local election administrators, which we all saw sort of in the aftermath of the last election and the lead up, frankly, to an attack on our American democracy on January 6th. The election integrity can't be overstated. And so this bill actually does important things to convince the American people that our elections are safe and secure. But more importantly to me, as sort of a member of the polity, it protects those, I think, frankly, heroic Americans who are actually doing the work every day of election administration, that are at the polls, that are helping people fill out their forms, that are helping elderly folks get through the parking lot to the polling sites. And those people should not be under attack. And the Brennan Center has done some incredible work that's really painful to hear about folks whose kids are threatened for their work that they're doing, and just death threats made against election officials. This bill would really increase protections for those election workers. And it also increases protections for folks who are just trying to vote, right? So we obviously saw incredible levels and efforts at voter intimidation. And voter intimidation, the penalties for it are increased in this bill as well as the banning of disinformation. One of the things that I love about it is how proactive it is. So if there is a piece of disinformation that's being floated around, like we saw, for instance, in Michigan, there were some guys that got together, orchestrated these robocalls where they lied to people and said, if you register to vote, you will be, your credit card companies will come after you, and you're gonna be forced, there will be a forced mandate for your vaccination, all sorts of cockamamie stuff that they were targeting people with. That sort of disinformation would be prohibited by this bill. And more importantly, there's an affirmative requirement that state officials and the Attorney General disabuse people of whatever information is coming out. So once that information is out, there's a responsibility actively of the government to stop it and tell people the truth, which I just think is really powerful in this climate. The bill provides grants to states so that they can get paper ballots, and folks, like I said, can know that their votes are counted and their votes are counted as cast. So we already, again, I love to emphasize that part of the reason that's driving these horrible voter suppression efforts is the big lie, which is literally just a lie, because what's amazing about our election is that the 2020 election, according to Donald Trump's DHS, was the most secure election in American history. And Brennan Center always likes to remind people, you are more likely to be hit by lightning than you are to commit voter fraud. But even with those things being true, we want folks to know and have sort of the security to know that our elections actually do have integrity. And so this bill would advance those as well. It also, unfortunately, is deeply responsive to things that we were seeing at the state level that were just sort of, at least in my opinion, heinous. So, for instance, we know that Georgia voters may have been waiting 10 hours in line, and Georgia then passed a law after seeing those 10-hour lines that prohibited people from getting food and water while they were standing in line. So again, putting yourself in the shoes of folks who are standing out in line, you're an elderly person, you can't get a glass of water from somebody, and it's a crime to be able to do that. This bill would just stop that. It says you can absolutely give food and water to people in line. And one of the great things about it is that it actually, again, practically limits lines to 30 minutes. And it's not just mandating that. What it's actually doing is providing states support so that we can make sure that election administration is efficient at the polls. And like I said, hopefully we'll never see another 10-hour line, because folks have so many options now: voting by mail, early voting, curbside voting. I feel like it's like Dr. Seuss, like in a plane, in a car, in in your socks, you can vote. It's great, So those are sort of really granular things that these really smart people on the Hill have been putting together. But there are also some beautiful macro things that I really want us to get to. You guys know how incredibly important redistricting is. This bill bans partisan gerrymandering, and it establishes clear, neutral standards for congressional redistricting, which I just think is so important because literally a lot of these maps are being drawn without rules that are coming from a centralized place. And so that means that a lot of their smoke-filled rooms where a lot of these deals are being cut that end up hurting folks who are not being represented by these maps. So the Freedom to Vote Act would strengthen protections for communities of color and how we draw maps, but also for communities of interest, which I can't emphasize enough. Again, this is not just a race issue or a language issue. Communities of interest are folks who may share an ethnicity, may share a religious background, may share a water table. And the way that redistricting is structured in this bill, communities of interest are thought of collectively and are not going to be split up, and they should have a voice together, whether that's your religion or how you all garden. And one thing that's really cool about the bill is that it actually has mechanisms that if a map is drawn, can be sort of paused and really quickly, literally expedited in the courts so that any map that does run afoul of this can be quickly addressed in the courts and fixed. So we're sort of closing that loophole that allows for a lengthy litigation to mean that a bad and discriminatory map is allowed to continue forward. That loophole is closed by this bill in a really powerful way. And finally, we're going to get to the part of my favorite part of the bill, which is sort of a surprise to me, but it's actually, technically it's campaign finance. When you say it that way, it sounds really boring. Actually, the way that I frame it and what I think is really true about it is that it's this part of the bill, the campaign finance part, is the first time I have ever seen a bill in our country that just asks, what infrastructural changes could we simply make to actually create a democracy that reflected the American people? And that's why it's my favorite part of the bill, is because we're fundamentally not just saying, hey, should we protect the right to vote that technically has been available to everybody since 1965? We're doing a little bit more than answering questions from 1965 with this bill. We are finally forward looking and thinking about what our country could actually be like if it really fulfilled its full potential. So I think to sort of telescope all of that into its most potent soundbite, if there's one thing that you guys take away from me tonight, it is this thing that I think is crazy. The 117th Congress, which is the current Congress, is the most diverse Congress in American history. It is the most diverse Congress, which feels like we're doing great, right? Which should be really laudable. Well, that Congress, the most diverse Congress in American history, is 77% white, 74% male. And the last time we were able to do a survey like this of the most recent Congress, the 116th, fewer than 5% of those Congress people had ever reported working a blue collar job. Add to that the fact that the current Senate, 2/3 of them are millionaires. We are so just underrepresented in the way that all of this works. And so not only are women barely 1 in 4 people in Congress, one of the things that I tell people, because I think this is sort of shocking to folks, is 2011 was the first year that women members of the House of Representatives had their own bathroom on the House floor. Prior to that, they had to walk away from the House floor to go to the public restroom. They would have to leave votes if they wanted to use the bathroom. And I share that because I think what it communicates is that these structures were not designed for everybody. And we have an incredible opportunity with this bill to change that. And when I share those stats, it's not just sharing them because I think diversity matters for diversity's sake. I don't actually think that that is the argument that I'm making at all. I think what's really compelling about that, when you start putting the dots together about who gets these seats in Congress, what you realize is that who is at the table dictates what policies get lifted up. And when you see that we don't have women there, right? We don't have a lot of working class people. We don't have people that are lifting up the priorities of everyday Americans. Suddenly it makes sense why there aren't common sense things that all Americans agree and care about, like childcare that's accessible, or healthcare that makes sense, or paid family leave. And those sort of bread and butter issues are not what's front and center, but instead estate taxes are being lifted up, or tax cuts for the rich. And I think once you sort of click in about the fact that we are not at the table, so our priorities are not getting lifted up, you realize that we actually just need to change who gets a seat at the table. And that is what the Freedom to Vote Act does. So through its campaign finance pieces, super simple mechanism. There is a fund that does not have a cent of taxpayer money in it. It is entirely funded by corporate lawbreakers. So when corporate bad guys break the law, they have to pay into this fund. And from that fund, we get to actually support candidates for the House who represent everyday people. So you shouldn't have to be a rich person to run for office. And this bill, through this campaign finance, it's voluntary small dollar public financing, means that out of that corporate bad guy fund, I can pay $1 into Roseanne's campaign. Roseanne's my next door neighbor. She runs my Girl Scout troop. I think she's great. She is, a union worker at a blue collar job. She doesn't look like the rich candidate that is running, but my dollar, because she has proven an incredible candidate, gets matched from this fund with a 6-to-1 match. And suddenly that changes who gets a seat at the table in this really profound way. And another sort of thing in the bill that I actually is very dear to my heart, and something that I worked on really closely, is a part of the bill called the Help America Run Act. Get ready, if you're not sitting down, please do, because the current status of the law under campaign finance is that if you want to use your campaign funds to rent a tuxedo for a campaign event, that's totally fine. Nobody will even ask you a question about that. But if you want to use your campaign funds, you're a working mom who's running for office, you want to use your campaign funds to pay a babysitter to go to that same event, that same campaign event, you need to ask for special permission from the FEC. And that just very clearly demonstrates to me that, again, these structures, working parents being at the table would make a change for how great our public schools were, right? How well our kids were being taken care of. And what's mind-blowing to me is the person who champions that part of the bill, Hara, Katie Porter from California, I think part of why she does it is because, believe it or not, she is the first ever single parent of young kids to serve in the Congress. And that is the difference that it makes when you have people who have lived experience at the table, right? And my most salient example of this that always just breaks my heart is just thinking recently about Cori Bush. And Cori Bush going and sleeping on the Capitol steps and making it possible for millions of Americans to stay in their homes against eviction. And the reason that she could do that, I think she held that conviction in her heart, is because she talks about sleeping in her car with her 2 babies. And I just don't think that folks who don't have experience or insight into what it means to be an American who struggles can represent everybody's interest in the exact same way. And I don't think everybody has the same interest for sure, but I think getting more of us at the table in those 535 seats means that more of us could be represented in profound ways that really matter. And I also think part of the reason some of these people are so against this is because they are obsessed with making people tired of politics, just making people think that it doesn't matter to their everyday lives. And when you see it, you just want to turn off the TV. But I think in actuality, if folks realize that the things we can change are just bread and butter that matter to so many of us, literally red states and blue states, I think there'd be an incredible amount of change. And one of the sort of pieces that are a secret about the bill that opposition to the bill doesn't want you to know is that polling indicates, actually Jane Mayer wrote about it in the New Yorker. It was this much of a sort of a revelation. Polling indicates massive bipartisan support among voters for this bill. So Republicans, independents, and Democrats alike support what's in the bill. But the only people who are uniformly against what's in this bill are Republican leadership. And it's because it does things that would actually be destructive to the power structures for both, incumbents and Republicans and Democrats. It takes away power from the way things have always been done. And I think that's part of the resistance. That's part of why the people matter in this movement, because we can say, hey, we happen to not have been the beneficiaries of this structure that fundamentally does not include everybody. So we would like to see it change. And I think that's the groundswell that you're seeing with this bill right now. So I share all of that to say that that is what is at stake. It's not just, again, the question about the freedom to vote from 1965. It's literally the best opportunity we have had, I think, really since Watergate, to create an America that actually reflects the power, beauty, potential, diversity of the American people. So I think that's sort of where I want to leave us, is that the reason it matters for you to be on this call, the reason it matters to share, I hope some of these anecdotes that you will share with your community, is because we have a moment that I have never seen before, right? So I've been working in politics for a long time. I've been a lawyer for about a decade. And I think the thing I want to leave you on is understanding that this moment is completely unique in time. So like Nancy said, I had the incredible privilege of getting to work on the first iteration of the bill. It was blood, sweat, and tears. My family didn't see me for months. Like, the joke was that my boss was very generous and gave me Christmas Day off. And so I could come and see my family for that one day. But other than that, this is all we were thinking about for months. And again, years have been put into this bill. And again, like hundreds of people have put incredible sweat equity and thought into it. And so when I was sitting on the House floor, I watched John Lewis speak for the bill. I cried like a baby on C-SPAN, which I'm still really embarrassed about to this day. But, it was just so emotional and beautiful. And I remember that happening in March of 2019. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, like everything's going to change. The sky is going to open up. Angels are going to be flying over the Capitol dome. Like, this is just an incredible thing that we've gotten to be part of. And I remember going home and the next day opening up the New York Times, and this big transformative thing was maybe page 4 of the newspaper. They didn't even bother to name the bill. They were just like, Democrats did some technocratic thing that nobody cares about, right? And so I'm heartbroken, but I also am still a true believer. So I feel like I'm carrying around a little pebble in my pocket that I sort of worry from time to time saying, I think we could save American democracy. Now, fast forward this many years, you could tip me over with a feather if you told me that in mid-October at nighttime, I'd be on a call with 100 Montanans talking about this bill and why it matters, and that this call would be happening on the heels of literally tens of thousands of people marching on Washington, D.C., marching on Atlanta, marching in Texas, because this vote matters so much to them, because this bill matters so much to them. So we went from a nobody bill on page 4 to suddenly the bill is so important that Michelle Obama is out here talking about it. And it's so important that Mike Pence is out here talking about why he hates it. Like, that's how you know you've succeeded as a bill. We are doing great, right? And when I first joined Senate for Senator Harris's team, I was told as a new staffer, a bill takes 8 years from ideation to maybe passage. And so what I want to point out to you all, and what we're all part of right now, is an actual miracle. And that miracle has been made possible by you. That we have gone from a nobody cares to, we're 2 people shy. We just need to spend the next couple of months getting 2 people to come on board with us to make this thing a reality. We are this close to fundamentally transforming American democracy. And that is what you all will make possible by spreading the word that I've shared with you tonight. So I'm thrilled to be able to have gotten to do this with you. And I can't express to you enough how grateful I am that your engagement is the thing that moves us over the line, because people like me can do all sorts of work behind the scenes, but until the American people take it as their own responsibility, that sort of sacred responsibility, it's not going to get done, but I think we actually can. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Nancy, and just thank you again so much for having me and for listening.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. I am enthused myself and excited. I hadn't quite got that angle on it that you just expressed, and I can see why this is such an important piece of legislation. We do have a number of questions in the chat, so I'll just take them in order. And the first one is, why are not all 18-year-olds automatically registered just like they are for the Selective Service to vote?
I think that's an absolutely great question. I actually point it out all the time. If they can find your postcard to tell you you can go fight a war, I don't know why they can't find your mailbox to tell you that you're voted, that you have the right to vote. But I think this is it's an important point. It's something that I would encourage you guys to bring up with your state legislature if you think there might be willingness there. And I will say one of the things that's cool about what has happened is that it's starting to move the flag posts. So the fact that we can even be talking about pre-registration meant that actually one of our Congresswomen, Ayanna Pressley, in the last cycle offered us an amendment to the bill, moving the voter age to 16. So I think we get to have these conversations out that we weren't having before, like automatic voter registration for everybody, and changing the voting age, because we're starting to sort of push out. So I think we're setting some flanks that are causing some creative work. And I think the answer to the question is there's no good reason that's not in there. It could be in there. I would encourage your state legislature to be the template that inaugurates it.
Thank you. There's a couple questions in here about what arguments do you anticipate in opposition to the Freedom to Vote Act? And in particular, just one second, let me scroll down here. One of our senators, Senator Daines, has said he's against the bill because of ballot harvesting. And he also thinks that it's the federal government interfering with state rights. So what do you say to other arguments against the bill and to these 2 in particular?
So the arguments, and actually I'm quite heartened by this because, I think it is a good indicator of the strength of the bill, the fact that the opposition arguments that are being made about the bill are often just based on lies. So we've seen Ted Cruz, sitting in a Senate hearing, talking about the provisions of the bill and saying the bill allows for immigrant voting or non-citizen voting, which is just not true, right? Like they're telling actual lies about the bill in the first instance. And I think when your opposition is forced to lie, it means that you actually probably are working with really good stuff. And like I said, Republican voters are in support of what's in the bill already. To the point about, again, ballot harvesting is really, it drives me nuts, right? Because again, the instance that they're referring to happened when I was in the House. It was election fraud that was being perpetrated, frankly, by the Republican Party. And I always like to point out, election fraud and voter fraud were illegal, are illegal, will always be illegal, right? The thing that this bill is doing is letting more people vote. So to the extent that maybe your safest elections could occur if you allowed no one to vote because then no one could commit voter fraud, maybe that's the argument that these guys are making, but it just doesn't make any sense. What this bill is doing, like I said, is of bringing more people who are eligible voters onto the rolls using secured systems that we already know work, such as automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration. And again, providing money to states so that they can make sure that their elections are secure, so that they can use paper ballots. And so I just think, again, like, what is really disgusting to me is this idea about voter fraud is being trotted out. It's not actually legal. It never was. And it's not actually happening. Like I said, the 2020 election was the most secure in American history. And I think it's weird that the party who was responsible or was in power during that is making arguments about it like the results were inaccurate. It doesn't make any sense. To the point about federal overreach, I think, and again, this is very disappointing to me, I wish the senators responsible for this would read what is in the bill. And perhaps would you serve by reading the Constitution? Because I refer everybody to the elections clause of the Constitution, which expressly gives the federal government alongside the states the right to make laws about time, places, and manner of how elections work. And I think an important sort of bit of context that helps us understand why it's important for Congress to be stepping in is, to me, and again, you guys have seen a lot of this voter suppression efforts are really race-based. They are trying to get working class people out of the system. They're trying to, intimidate immigrants who are lawful citizens into not voting. And I think a lot of what is upsetting to me about that is that when states have the opportunity to do the right thing and they don't, I think the federal government is obligated to use that power given to them in the elections clause to step in. And so the best analog that I can use is there was a point in this country where we decided that invidious racial discrimination in schools was no longer to be okay. And so some states stood up and said, we don't care about you wanting to integrate schools. We're not going to do it. And what happened? The president stepped up and said, that's not going to work in our country. These are not our values. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. The voter suppression based on the color of someone's skin is not our value. And in fact, it is illegal. And so if a state wants to use underhanded methods to be able to achieve that, it shouldn't be allowed to do that, right? And again, like, it is really unfortunate to me that I can give you lots of examples of just straight up race-based voter discrimination efforts. And we were talking about the Native American community, Nancy, and example I always give that blows everybody's mind is when North Dakota instituted its voter ID law, they said, well, it's very common sense and it's super simple. And now one of the challenges was that on this super simple voter ID law was the requirement for having an address on your card, which again, seems like it's common sense. Until I think it was the Deputy Secretary of State in the North Dakota legislature went and said to them, stood up and said, y'all, if you do this address requirement on this voter ID law, you will disenfranchise many Native Americans because guess what? The state does not assign everybody on a reservation an address. So they don't even have the opportunity to meet the requirement that you were trying to write into law. And even after hearing that testimony, because the law was going to disenfranchise Native American voters, the legislature went ahead and passed that bill, right? And it caused this whole fracas. And thank God people were able to organize and get people the ID that they needed. There's that sort of example of I'm happy to leave folks to their own, business if they don't actually hurt the American voters and break the law. And I think this is the federal government just stepping in under the power of the elections clause that grants them that power to do the right thing. So sorry, that was a long-winded way of answering, but it is not federal overreach. It's actually, and again, these people love to cite the law and they cite it inaccurately. And so I tell anybody that asks that the elections clause absolutely allows this and in fact encourages it because invidious discrimination at the state level will otherwise be.
Thank you. That's a very thorough answer to all of those arguments we've been hearing here and there. The next question has to do with who would actually enforce mandatory changes to gerrymandered voting districts?
I think the litigation is probably going to be the backstop. I'd ask you to let me follow up on it because I don't want to say for sure if that's all the mechanisms that are. But what's really cool about the way that the bill lays this out, like I said, currently there are no standards. I was just reading actually from one of my colleagues, Michael Lee, who does brilliant work on this, that there was one part in Pennsylvania, I think it might have been 2011, where in the same day they released the map, had a 7 a.m. hearing on the map, a very early morning meeting on the map, then put the map through committee and then voted it out all in one day with no input from anybody at all about what that map looked like. And under the current rules, which frankly are non-existent, that activity was totally permissible. But what's great about this bill is that it sort of standardizes. It's going to say, hey, these are certain criteria that need to be met for your congressional district to work. And then it is up to, you just can't break the law, right? But as we know, when the law is broken, the enforcement mechanism that we have is litigation. And that's again where the For the People Act has really, the Freedom to Vote Act has really specific mechanisms that are built in. Like I said, putting on pause maps that are shown to be discriminatory, allowing for the redrawing of those maps in an expedited fashion, the litigation of those maps in an expedited fashion, that I think really creates an opportunity to beat back some of the worst efforts at gerrymandering. Now, that being said, I think it's also really important to point out the urgency for that reason, because as you all well know, map drawing is happening right now. And until this law is sealed and signed, we can't make the argument with absolute certainty that these folks are breaking the law by drawing partisan discriminatory maps. And so I emphasize that we need to get the bill signed so that states can't sort of use this little window of delay to pass discriminatory maps that are going to affect and hurt voters for the long run. So yes, I think litigation is the enforcement, but also what we see, and actually this is a really, I thought a really fascinating data point, that part of the strength of something like the Voting Rights Act, which forced you this mechanism called preclearance, where if you wanted to do something that was going to affect voters in your state, you had to submit that proposed change to the DOJ for review. Now, when that got taken away with Shelby County v. Holder being gutted by the Supreme Court, one of the fascinating effects was us realizing that the existence of that preclearance mechanism alone was enough of a deterrent that states didn't even put things forward that they thought were going to be patently discriminatory. And now that it's sort of a free-for-all, you were seeing states put forward things that just feel like obviously they're not going to pass muster, right? Like again, like North Carolina put forward those voter suppression efforts that a federal court just said, literally, quote, these targeted African Americans with surgical precision. And I think that's the sort of stuff when we leave this gaping hole that allows for states to go forward. So I think the enforcement will be in litigation, but there's also a really important point to be made that with this sort of protection through the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, states that would happily be bad actors if left to be in a free-for-all will be disincentivized from actually doing that because they'll be locking themselves into litigation for the long haul.
Great. And speaking about the Supreme Court, with the example of the Citizens United decision, what is to prevent the Supreme Court from overturning any new voter rights legislation?
Well, they can only overturn it if they find it unconstitutional. And I think it's really important. This is where I sort of take a little bit of pride in having worked on the Hill. Those people are some of the smartest people I've ever worked with, and they are incredibly careful about what they're doing. They are not in the habit of wasting time. And so every bit of this 594-page bill, I can promise you, has been carefully vetted by groups all across the country, by the nation's leading lawyers, because we cannot afford for this thing to take a hit like that. And so it's been a proactive and front end effort by places like the Brennan Center, again, like places like Common Cause, all of these experts, the disability rights community, everybody's been consulted and brought in to say, hey, we need this thing to work for people. We need it to be administrable so it works for election officials and folks who are local. But then most importantly, we need for it to be airtight from a constitutional standpoint. So every point of it has been pressure tested. And like I just say quite simply, we are not in the habit of wasting our own time. So we wouldn't have put all this effort into this thing only to have it be struck down as unconstitutional. So I can promise you every piece of it has been looked at and I think will withstand scrutiny, which again is part of why, and I think this is, again, I can't point this enough. Jane Mayer wrote this brilliant article saying that Republican strategists like the Koch brothers were really stressed out about the bill because it was popular with people and it's constitutional. And so the usual avenues to be able to destroy it, a hit campaign publicly, or litigating against it, we're not actually going to work for them. And that's why they're working so hard on what they call under the dome tactics, right? That's why they're pushing and telling these lies about non-citizen voting and ballot harvesting, all these things that aren't happening because they're scrambling at this last minute to try to sink the bill with these lies about it. And I think, I'm an eternal optimist. And I think for that reason, we know that it's actually working, right? That they wouldn't be scrambling so hard to find these things and telling lies about the bill if we weren't actually really close to getting it done.
Well, that's a great way to look at it. Thank you. So here's a different question slightly. Are all the provisions of the Freedom Vote Act necessary? That is, if Congress finds any of these objectionable and they don't pass the whole bill, will the entire act fail?
Oh, well, I think that this is sort of an interesting, it's a bit of inside baseball stuff, but the Freedom to Vote Act is pared down from the original For the People Act. So to the question of whether every piece of it is necessary, I love it. And I love the For the People Act before it, because it literally is, it's not a smorgasbord, just sort of, I tell people, it's not a voting rights bill stapled to a campaign finance reform bill. It is a cohesive narrative that literally looks wholesale at our American democracy and says, what is wrong here? Let's take one swipe and fix it. And the best analog that I can raise for folks is the renovation of a house, right? Some people complain the bill is too big. which always really stresses me out because I just don't understand. Are these folks mad that Congress is doing its one job? Like, it doesn't make sense to complain that a bill is too big when there are so many things to actually fix in our democracy. And so when you realize that this bill is taking on all of those things in a wholesale way and saying, let's look, like I was saying to you before, that 8-year idea about a bill is because it is so difficult to get the attention of the American people, one, which then forces the American government to be responsive with its attention, right? So we really are going to get one bite at this. And so I think the idea of like, oh, we can pass some of it here and some of it there is really like saying to somebody, hey, why don't we renovate the whole house? We'll put all the money together and get everything together. But why don't we just leave the front door off the hinges? And maybe in a couple of years, we can put in some front windows. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense. So if you wouldn't do that with your house, why on earth would you do that with your democracy? We have a shot. We've generated all this momentum. We have so many people, literally, this thing has passed one chamber of Congress twice, and now is the top priority. Literally, it was HR 1 and it was S1. So the top priority of the House and the Senate. The Senate Majority Leader has said it was the first thing he was going to deal with when they came back from Congress. The president has made a public statement, right? And repeatedly a second with the bill, the vice president as well. This is so close to getting done that it's sort of like, why would you compromise now? Why would you negotiate against yourself? And more importantly, you're not getting anything by that negotiation, right? So the Freedom to Vote Act is the compromise bill of the person who was leading the charge against this bill. And so the fact that he went from a public op-ed saying, I'll never support these, to actually being the leader architect of the new bill, to me, is an example of, I think, my truth, which is frankly, 2 weeks in Washington is an eternity. And better to look at what they do than what they say, right? And so the fact that we've gone into this climate where Joe Manchin was against this bill until he became the architect of it, which is amazing because now he needs to be the leader to get it done, right? And so I think that there is a reason to be really heartened by all of those developments. And again, that's a lot of inside baseball Washington stuff, but I think it does help us understand that we were asking for the sun, the moon, the stars, and the sky, and we got the sun, the moon, and the stars. So I'm not really mad about that ultimately, right? And we don't get this kind of energy around bills very often at all. The last time I saw it was probably the ACA, where when I was working in the Senate, you literally couldn't go to your office without stepping over moms that were covered in those silver blankets in the atrium because they did not want you to go to your desk thinking that they didn't care about what was happening. And that changed the course of history, right? And I think that's what we had. That's literally the opportunity that I feel like we're facing right now. We're seeing congressional leaders get arrested for this. The kids are planning civil disobedience out in front of the White House. This is a moment unlike we've seen. And I think it's what an exciting part to be part of, but also a really good reason to take heart.
We will have a couple more questions here. I think we'll wind this up around 8 because my goodness, you have been just on stage this whole time, just so enthusiastic. Thank you so much. I don't want to wear you out, but I have a wonderful comment here. I'm a community enthusiast from Nashville, Indiana. Thank you so much for your work. I'm a single working mother of 2 elementary kids who is also serving in my first term on my town council. I have ambitions for higher office, but identify with the struggle. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about the campaign finance aspect, and perhaps I'll throw on the end of this question, explain a little bit more about why it's in the House and not in the Senate.
Yes. So a couple of things. First, congratulations. I am so proud of you. That is so exciting. And I think it's really important because you are representing exactly the folks that I'm talking about. It's somebody who has lived experience and needs to be at the table, who can deal with the practical realities of this, right? If you were so rich that you never had to worry about whether you could hire a babysitter while you quit your job full-time to run for office, you are not like most American people, right? And that means you're not going to do as great a job as our friend who is a single mom of 2 parents, who's also serving her community at the same time that I bet she's working for. So I say that. The questions were, why just the House? It used to be the Senate and the House. If I were being cynical, I might say the reason that it got cut out of the Senate is because the bill is being considered in the Senate. And like I said, a lot of these people who are in power right now are in power because they were in power under these old systems. And so we're actually asking these Congress people to sacrifice some of that power by passing this bill, right? To change the stakes so that you don't have to be a millionaire to run for office. Like, do I wish they'd kept it in the Senate? Yes, I wish they had. They didn't. At least it is preserved by the House. And I do think that one of the things we'll see is sort of a realization about why it's so important to have people with lived experience at the table, at least from the House. So I'd say let's be glad that we got it in the House, right? Like I said, sun, moon, and stars. Well, sun and stars. And maybe we set a template for it to be able to be passed in the Senate. I also think once folks see who is actually getting to be at the table, right? And not for nothing, our last presidential election literally asked the question, which septuagenarian white male millionaire would you like to run the country? Obviously, they were very, very different, but the fact that those were the categories that we got doesn't feel like it reflects everybody in the room. So the diversity part of it is really important. And also one thing I want to point out, and again, who is at the table matters, but the systems have been structured in these ways that really don't allow everybody to be at the table. So our friend who's running is a statistical anomaly, because what I learned when doing research for the first draft of this bill is that men will often report the reason that they run is because they felt they were going to be good at it. Women are often called to run more because their community saw a specific need and asked them to. So on average, a woman has to be asked to run 7 times before she will seriously consider it. So tell everybody, I'm telling you, I don't even know you, but I want you to run. If you're on this call, it's because you care about our country. And so I think you should run, right? So count me as the first one and tell your friends that they have 6 more. That's one part of it. Another thing that blows my mind is that there was a survey done by the Center for American Women in Politics of sitting state legislators, so of women who had won their races. And you know that 1/3 of them reported being repeatedly deterred from running by party officials because they were looked at maybe as unelectable, right? And these party apparatuses are accreted power that usually look a certain way. It's usually a bunch of people that all have similar life experiences. And they might look at the rest of us and go, I don't think you should get a seat at the table. So I'm going to tell people that you can't win. And small dollar public financing just changes what is possible there. Things like the Help America Run Act change what's possible there because you can see working moms, right? So the lady who this woman, Luba Gretchen Shirley, who ran for office, who was the one that went to the FEC to ask for that permission to get her babysitter paid. And she created a national news story, right? Like her work is the genesis of a lot of what's happening there. So I think when we step forward and say, hey, these systems were not built for us, right? The way that we design HARA, it's not just childcare. You can use your campaign funds as well to pay for elder care. And again, we know that discrimination in this country works in such a way that women are carrying more of the domestic burden. So we're very likely to be working full time as our partner. And in the context of a heterosexual couple, women are not only working full time, but they're also doing 80% of the domestic work as well, right? So there are just all these burdens and demands on us that I think give us unique insight into what sort of support we would need. So this bill would pay for your childcare, would allow you to use your campaign funds to pay for your childcare, for your elder care, for any dependents that you were taking care of. If you had a disabled sibling, they would be covered as well. And for you to cover your health insurance premiums. Because as somebody who's running, you literally look at that and say, to run for the House is a full-time job. I'm going to have to quit my job. I've got to figure out how to pay our health insurance premiums while that's happening. And this bill is a little step to be able to help change that set of circumstances. I will also just point out that the current status quo is that you can actually pay yourself a salary up to a cap under current campaign finance law. But again, that doesn't look great. And so working class candidates tend not to take that option because you don't want to say, hey, I'm paying myself to run, because it just doesn't look great. So this is a workaround to be able to sort of normalize it. But I share those things to say every American who cares for her community should not be left out of that system because she's not a millionaire. And that's exactly the stuff that's being done in this bill. So I'm happy to talk about it offline too, the Help America Run Act. And again, I'm really proud of Katie Porter for making it happen. It actually passed the House, believe it or not, with bipartisan support as a standalone bill. So I think it's a great example. Rodney Davis stood on the floor. He's our Republican leader from Illinois, who's the Committee of House Administration, head for the Republican side. And he talked about his twins. He talked about his wife, who's a nurse, and how hard it was for them to get the kids out the door every morning and to be running for office on top of that. And I just think it's a great example of where there's common ground for regular American people about so many common sense things around this bill.
Thank you. So I have 2 more questions that we'll be able to handle tonight. The first one is a technical question, and then the second one is back into what can we do? So let me ask the first question about the technicalities of it. Can you explain a little bit more about the efficiency gap partisan bias measurements that are used in defining what is gerrymandering?
I don't know what the efficiency gap bipartisan bias measurements are, but I can say that there are really clear standards that are laid out under the current. Let me see if I can find. Give me one second. Okay, so at least what we're now requiring, right? The uniform criteria that are actually going to now be used. And again, remember, it is currently a free-for-all. You don't have any rule. And that's literally what gerrymandering is you could just be like, well, I don't like the cut of this jib of these people, so I just leave them out of the map. And that would actually be perfectly fine because it is a total free-for-all. So what the bill would do, like I said, it prohibits partisan gerrymandering, right? Which we often know is also a proxy for a lot of other kind of ugly cutting out of community. But it requires these states to use uniform criteria. And those criteria are super straightforward. It is 4 things. It's compliance with the US Constitution. It's compliance with the Voting Rights Act. It allows you to protect groups that are protected currently under the Voting Rights Act, so long as they can show that they can nominate candidates and elect people of their choice, right? So it basically says, it's sort of strange, but the reality is right now, if you are above 50% minority community, then you can say, well, we need these kinds of protections, but you still got to litigate over it, and it's not necessarily clear that would work for you. This bill would just say, hey, if you can show that you're a protected VRA group and that you actually could get your guys elected, we can't dilute the power of your vote. And then the 4th thing, like I was talking about earlier, is making sure that maps are drawn to represent communities of interest. And I cannot emphasize more broadly, that's not limited to people who are protected by the Voting Rights Act. That is any group that shares a common interest. So, again, the water table, right? People who really are affected by things that politics is about can come together and be protected under this bill. And again, just sort of other quick things about the redistricting measures. It allows the courts to develop the plans if the states fail to do so. So if a state doesn't meet the deadline or otherwise, if a state fails to meet the deadline to enact congressional redistricting, then a citizen can sue to have the court actually enact a plan instead. And again, the court and then is subject to the exact same criteria that we just talked about. It suddenly just creates a roadmap where there was no roadmap. And also, I had mentioned this earlier, but the Freedom to Vote Act would allow the Attorney General and private citizens to sue to enforce the Freedom to Vote Act. So not only can you sue, that then you would get the benefit of the expedited measures in court that we were talking about earlier as well. So they really sort of thought of this from a soup to nuts sort of way. But those 4 criteria make really clear what the realities are.
Okay, thank you very much. So our last question, and I'll kind of wrap 2 together here, is what is the pathway for getting this bill passed? Can it be filibustered by the Senate? And finally, wrapped around that is, what are the best strategies for folks to take that will make the biggest impact in getting these 2 voting laws passed?
It is absolutely passable. Like I said, I think the way we need to recalibrate our perspective on this, right? We went from begging around to be like, could we maybe get automatic voter registration? The fact that I've spent 58 minutes with you all talking about what is inside this bill means that we've gotten automatic voter registration plus so much more, right? And we are having this conversation because it is so close to pass it, right? So the question about the filibuster, again, I cannot overstate that they keep talking about the filibuster as though we would need to convince 10 Republicans to move to be in support of this bill, which, pigs might fly. I haven't seen it, but I don't think it's going to happen. And actually, what's really important for us to know is that does not mean this bill is dead in the water. What it actually means is the Senate needs to take advantage of this other procedural workaround that is available to it. Now, Senate rules are changeable by a vote of the simple majority of the Senate. And so the technicality of it is that it's not technically a rule change. Basically, if we just called a vote of the 50 senators to say, hey, we all support this bill, we're now at a place where we're all actually behind it and we're all co-sponsoring it, which is actually the case now. Again, I can't state this enough. Every Democratic senator is a sponsor of this bill, right? Is supportive of what is in this bill. But if those 50 senators got together with the vice president added in as the tie-breaking vote, they could just vote to effectively change the rules of the Senate. So instead of needing 60 people to begin debate on the bill, you could just say, hey, we're going to begin the debate on the bill with a simple majority, 51 of us voting. And now that 51 of us there are 2 things you vote on. First, you vote to open debate, which is the cloture motion that you sometimes are hearing about. And then the bill is being considered on its merits, and then you vote on the actual bill. So the vote on the actual bill, that second vote is only a 51 vote threshold. So they could vote to change the 60 vote threshold to just say, hey, let's actually get this done. And I think that's something that we need to talk about for so many important priorities that are being lifted up right now. We have a unified government. There is an opportunity to actually get things done. And I think the question that you last asked is the operative one, because the actual question is, how do we get the folks right now who are on the line to change their mind? And I think that is where this call, the reason we are spending this time together is because you need to be equipped for the arguments so that you can write them and call them and fax them every day to say, I need you to get this done. Because for Pete's sake, you have one job, right? Your job is just to actually function and protect the American people. And that's all we're asking you to do. People literally, like I said, we've been working on this for years, have put together a package that all you need to do is get to Joe Biden's desk so he can sign it, because he said he's waiting for it, right? So the things that you can practically do, call your senator, absolutely, right? But I think the other thing, particularly for you guys in Montana, people don't talk often enough about just senators pay attention to your local paper way more than they pay attention to the Washington Post or the New York Times. So I can't emphasize enough, letters to the editor are going to have a really big effect if everybody's writing every day to say, hey, Senator, where are you on this? Because we need it, right? And it's, again, Republican voters support it, Democratic voters support it, independents support it. Like, why wouldn't you support it, right? So letters to the editor are a really powerful tool. Another thing that I tell people as an organizing tool that's amazing, you know, pandemic is horrible, but one of the great things about it is I'm sitting here chatting with you. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. I'd rather be in Gardner, Montana, but I'm in Brooklyn, New York. You could have a town hall where you invite both of your senators to say, hey, Sun Wonk from the Brennan Center just taught us all about this bill. I think it's pretty great. Here are the reasons I support it. Senator, since I know that you would never need to suppress a vote or rig an election to win, it seems like common sense would dictate that you would agree with me and support this bill. So I'd love for you to hop on a Zoom and explain to us Montanans why you don't support it or why you do, right? And I think people, this is maybe the political operative in me, but I think have the Zoom. And if they don't show up, it's as much a news story as if they do, because then you get to say, hey, so-and-so couldn't walk over from his kitchen to spend 30 minutes with us on Zoom explaining why he doesn't want to have this bill that's going to bring millions of eligible Americans onto the rolls. So organize the Zooms, invite them. Maybe they come and surprise you, which is great, because then now you can use the information that I've just shared with you. And if they don't, then you better write to every paper that's within spitting distance of you and tell them, I don't know what Senator so-and-so is doing, because why didn't he show up, right? So yeah, letters to the editor, calling them. But I think the biggest thing, and this is sort of what moves me about this work, is actually telling your community about what's going on. So there is so much that's always demanding our attention. I think that folks are probably hearing about the voter suppression stuff. You guys on this call are sort of the elites of this. So you might know about the bill, but I think a lot of people don't. So I think the news that they're getting is all bad news, you know, which is often the case in America, right? But I think if you can use this information to talk to your churches, talk to your neighbors, talk to your soccer teams, talk to your kids, you know, your PTA friends, to tell them that this bill is here and it's packaged up and ready to go and 2 people away from just being signed into law, I think getting them to be motivated to do the same things actually really matters, because one call to your senator is one call, but if you can get 10 other people to call, think about the change that you're actually making, right? So yeah, letters to the editor, and also think about op-eds, right? Actually, I'll share with you, Nancy, if you remind me, I have 3 tools that are set up already from our allies, from Common Cause and from legal conservation voters, where you can, there are 6 people in the White House that they were like, these people, we're gonna have a handwriting letter campaign. The other folks at Common Cause are having a phone bank where every day they're calling people, oh, this is genius, I forgot, you guys. There's calling people in the states that actually matter. So if you call Senator Manchin's office, nobody cares because you're from Montana. But if West Virginians call Senator Manchin's office, you better believe there are kids who are spending all their days just tallying numbers and saying, okay, sir, a lot of people are calling about this. We probably should do something about it. So Common Cause, the genius organizers over there, have set up a phone bank. So those of us who care can call West Virginians. We call our fellow citizens and say, fellow citizen, a wonk at the Brennan Center just told me this is really important and we're within spitting distance of passage. But if you call Joe Manchin, he'll listen to you. So we are organizing all across this country. Right now, there's a relay, literally like an old school relay, passing a baton in your wheelchair, on your bicycle, walking to get to Washington, D.C. to talk about this bill. So it is a people movement, like I said, that's unlike anything I've ever seen. It's happening in real time. And I'll send you guys the concrete tools that are a template for letters to the editor, a template for an op-ed, a template for your handwritten note to folks. But just people are active on this in ways I've never seen. And you spreading the word right now to your community and asking them annoyingly to do the same things that you are doing changes this from sort of a prospect to, I think, an inevitability in a way that I hope is inspiring to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I just had one last question that you don't need to answer because it's a question for me. And that is, yes, this presentation is being recorded and we will be posting a link to it. For sure, we'll be posting it on the website of the League of Women Voters of Montana. You can go there to find it sometime after tomorrow. And if I actually can figure out how to do it, I'll see if I can also get it put into the email that you shall be receiving tomorrow as a follow-up from having come to this webinar. So can't guarantee that one because we're just now mastering the technology of webinars here at the League, but for sure it will be on our website. So thank you so much. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your help this evening in understanding the Freedom to Vote Act and why it is critical that the Senate pass it. And thank you also for the great work that you're doing with the Brennan Center in researching and defending our democracy. I want to thank all of our co-sponsoring organizations, AAUW Montana, AAUW Missoula, Jeanette Rankin Peace Center, Great Falls Rising, Montana Now, National Organization for Women, and the local leagues of the women voters in Billings, Bozeman, Helena, and Missoula. And most of all, I want to thank all of you who came and attended this webinar. Our mission is to help citizens understand the issues and participate in our democracy. And right now is a moment in our history where that participation is more important than ever at any other point I can think of. So thank you all for being here this evening. This concludes our webinar, and a very good evening to you all.
Thank you so much again for having me. And I will say, if folks want to reach out to me because you want me to do this for somebody else, please, this is all I'm doing with my time. It's the most important thing I'm doing. I've done it in Iowa, in Nebraska, in Texas. The Heartland is really reaching out for this in a way that really matters. So I can't thank you enough for your time and for your sharing, and reach out to me if you need me to do it. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much.